Depression is not the same as sadness. In fact, sadness is to depression as a puddle is to the Pacific. They're both wet, but that's about where the comparison ends. And the descent into deep depression was absolutely the most terrifying experience of my life, and took me to the very edge of life. But you can get back from there. It is possible to recover.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sherry Jacobson, and this is Therapy Lab, a podcast dedicated to therapy, mental health, and the art of well-being. In this episode, we are joined by ex-police commander and author John Sutherland to talk about his story. Where should we start? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing?
Yeah, I'm a husband to one. I'm a dad to 3 girls, and I'm a retired police officer. So for more than 25 years, it was my extraordinary privilege to serve as an officer here in the Metropolitan Police in London. But I retired about 2.5 years ago on medical grounds, having had a nervous breakdown. I'm a whole lot better now than I was then. I made it back to work eventually, but I never made it back to full operational duties. And so that's why in the end it was time to say goodbye and just to find a quieter, gentler way to live life and do life. And so now I do a bit of writing, and I do a bit of speaking, and I do a fair bit of resting in between times.
Well, you do great writing and great speaking. You've done a fantastic TED Talk. You also talk about your experiences in the police force, and very openly. For those who haven't read the 2 books, I haven't read the second, only partway through the first. The first one's called Blue, Keeping the Peace While Falling to Pieces. Can you describe what it was like in general, going through the stresses and strains of being in service?
So I joined the police aged 22, back in the early 1990s. It was the only job I ever wanted to do from the age of about 16. It was the only application form I ever filled out, only interview I ever went for. I genuinely didn't have a plan B. Well, apart from maybe a slight unfulfilled hankering to be a pop star, but it was the only serious plan I ever had. And I ended up embarking on the adventure of a lifetime. It was, I still think it is, the greatest job in the world, the most extraordinary privilege. I often talk and I often write about the painful privilege of policing, which is to see all of life and all of death and everything in between at the scenes of crimes and car crashes and every imaginable kind of catastrophe. I wanted to be a part of something that mattered. I wanted to be part of an adventure. I wanted to help people. And for 25 years, that's what I was able to do. But I suppose if I've learned anything from my own experience, particularly over the last 6 or 7 years, recovering from a serious breakdown and still recovering now, it's that it would be impossible to do the job of a police officer for any length of time and to remain untouched, unaffected by the things that you see and the things that you do. There's some fairly recently emerging research that talks about or examines the exposure to extreme trauma. Most of us in the course of our normal lives will be exposed to extreme trauma on perhaps 3 or 4 occasions, which is 3 or 4 times too many, but that's life, that's reality. This research looked at police officers and paramedics, and it's estimated that during the course of their working lives, police officers and paramedics will be exposed to extreme trauma on something like 400 to 600 occasions. So 3 to 4 times in an ordinary life, 400 to 600 times in a policing life. And, you know, for as long as I was an operational officer, I'd never heard that talked about. I'd never heard it discussed or acknowledged. We just shrugged our shoulders and got on with it because that's the job, because that's what you join to do, and when you're a police officer, the calls never stop coming. It's only really with the benefit of hindsight that I've begun to reflect on these things and to realise that it cannot possibly be without consequence to see so much and to do so much in life's hurting places.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And so the notion there of every contact leaves a trace, which is that it's impossible to be unaffected and not impacted.
So it's an idea that I've sort of borrowed and adapted from forensic science. Mm. So it's actually, Edmond Locard was a French forensic scientist born in the 19th century who gave his name to this idea that remains fundamental to how we solve crimes still in the 21st century. Locard's principle says every contact leaves a trace. Every time two objects come into contact with one another, a trace is left. So if I reach forward to the glass, I've already left a trace of myself on the side of that glass. And so, you know, that's still what police officers and forensics experts are doing now at crime scenes. They're trying to find the trace of the suspect that's been left behind. Mm-hmm. And equally, when they catch up with the suspect, they're trying to find the traces of the scene that he's carried with him. Yeah. So it's this enduring principle of forensic science that as I've thought about it over the years, has an absolute direct human application. Mm. Every time two people come into contact with one another, a trace is left, an exchange takes place. And it's happening now. You know, whether we're talking about lifelong friends or passing strangers, every time two people come into contact with one another, we smile or we scowl, we encourage or we ignore, we hold out a hand of friendship or we withdraw it, we cross the road to help someone who's in trouble, or we turn around and we walk in the opposite direction, we bless or we curse, we love or we hate. But the point is that every single contact leaves a trace. And as a police officer, as a member of the emergency services, clearly that also applies in every situation that you find yourself called into the midst of, whatever that day's chaos happens to be.
Are there some incidents that have more of an impact and had on you? Were there ones that you recall as being particularly traumatic, or is it just a case of them adding up in a cumulative way?
I think it's both and. So when I'm talking now to audiences of serving officers and in effect telling my story, I talk about what I think caused my breakdown as best I understand it. And I talk first of all about just the general wear and tear of a policing life, just the miles on the clock, the laps of the track. You know, over time it just adds up. Even something as simple as shift working, that constant disruption of your body clock that we now know, you know, it's kind of unquestioned medical fact that messing around with your body clock is bad for your health, is bad for your well-being. So something as simple as that, and then obviously there is just this repeated exposure to trauma. But at the same time as that general wear and tear is building up, there are always within the arc of a policing life, which in my case was 25 years, there are always particular faces and places that you never forget, that you will undeniably, unavoidably carry with you for the rest of your days. And so as I sit here now talking to you, there are the names of people who've died, there are the names of colleagues who've died, there are images from crime scenes that I've attended 25 years ago that I could still recount to you in absolute detail. And I absolutely don't resent the fact that they're there. You know, in a sense, I count it a privilege to be able to keep the memories of some of these people alive, or, you know, the things that I've experienced have become a part of who I am. So I don't resent that they're there, but the one thing I can't do is deny that they're there. It's, you know, there are these faces and these places that I will carry with me till my dying day.
When were you first alerted to the signs of a breakdown? Did it happen very immediate that you were aware of, or were there sort of little indicators beforehand?
Yes and no, as in, yes, there were indicators, but no, I wasn't aware of them. And that, I guess, was part of the problem, and I guess is so often part of the problem for people. You know, anything that I've been able to understand about what happened to me is only with the benefit of hindsight, is only with the benefit of years of life and years of therapy and years of journey to kind of work it out and untangle it and look back on. At the time, I didn't have a clue. I really didn't have a clue. But, you know, again, when I'm talking to colleagues and trying to pass on a little bit of what I've learned, I say there were probably 3 sets of signs I now see that all wasn't well. The first were just signs in my body, you know, just various things that weren't working as well as they should have done. I had stomach trouble, I had lower back trouble, both of which I now understand are specific indicators of stress. More than anything was just an overwhelming sense of physical exhaustion, though. And my body, I now realise, was trying to tell me something, but I wasn't paying attention. Secondly was my behaviour. It began to change, but not in dramatic ways, so subtle that I barely noticed, and hardly anybody else noticed either. My wife noticed, one of my best friends at work noticed. Maybe 1 or 2 others did as well, but my wife and best friend were the only 2 people to talk to me about it. But I was becoming overwhelmed by the small things. So I was so full up with the big stuff of life, trying to be a good husband, trying to be a good dad, trying to be a good human being, absolutely trying to be a good police officer. I was so full up with that big stuff that I had no capacity left for anything. You know, it might have been something as simple as the girls needing help with their homework, or something as daft as a light bulb needing changing. But I was full to the brim and beyond. And so, you know, those closest to me began to notice these subtle changes in my behaviour. But I didn't pay enough attention to them. I didn't, because there was a life to be lived, and there was a family to provide for, and there was a job to be done. And as I mentioned earlier, when you're a police officer, the calls don't stop coming. So my body was trying to tell me, my behaviour was trying to tell me, and then in the end my brain took over because I wasn't listening to anything else. And I started experiencing the most extraordinary levels of anxiety, but very sort of non-specific. Now, anxiety in and of itself, like tiredness in and of itself, was not a completely unfamiliar thing to me. There have been lots of occasions in my life where I'd felt anxious in circumstances where anxiety would have been a perfectly normal, healthy human thing to feel. You know, before exams at school, before my interview to join the Met, when I asked my wife to marry me, when our children were born. You know, plenty of circumstances when anxiety is part of a healthy range of emotions. But get to the sort of the edge of my breakdown, and what I'd begun to experience was infinitely beyond anything I'd ever encountered before. And it started waking me up in the dead of the night, in almost that slightly kind of stereotypical way. I'd suddenly be wide awake, wide-eyed, kind of teeth clenched, white-knuckled terror, but with no obvious reason to explain it. I mean, what did I have to be anxious about? I'm one of those incredibly fortunate people who's married to his best friend, and we've got 3 healthy daughters who are growing up beautifully. And aside from the inevitable mortgage, we didn't have a penny of debt. Neither of us had stuff lurking in our past that was sort of threatening to jump out and derail us. And then there was work. Well, you know, it was demanding and it was stressful, but I loved every single passing minute of it. And so there seemed to be nothing, and yet there was everything in the middle of the night. And it was so bad that I'd have to wake my wife up just so that she could hold on to me and tell me that everything was going to be okay. But then the morning would come and I'd tell myself that I had to go again, that this was just one of these circumstances in life that I had to deal with. It was one of those things that I had to overcome. And so I kept going, not genuinely not understanding that I was ill, genuinely not recognizing that I needed help. And in the end, it was the depression that took me.
And how long did the symptoms and the signs last for?
So looking back now, I clearly it was building up for years, that wear and tear of a policing life. The symptoms were most obvious probably only for about 2 months before I finally broke. Yeah. And then I was off work for 7 months, having barely missed a day in my career up to that point. Yeah. And you know, the first 2 to 3 months of that were the most horrifying and terrifying experience of my life. In the first book that you're reading, and when I'm trying to explain depression to people who might not have experienced it, I say to them, depression is not the same as sadness. In fact, sadness is to depression as a puddle is to the Pacific. They're both wet, but that's about where the comparison ends. And the descent into deep depression was absolutely the most terrifying experience of my life, and took me to the very edge of life. But you can get back from there. It is possible to recover. And
at the lowest, was it very difficult to function on a day-to-day basis?
So I was, at the time, my job was slightly grandly titled the Borough Commander for Southwark in South London. So I was responsible for close to 1,000 police officers and staff, and responsible for policing in one of the busiest and most challenging parts of London. You know, I was trusted to run a borough, and within a very short space of time, I was scarcely able to run a bath. And that's not a metaphor. I mean, that's a literal statement of fact. I lost the ability almost completely to function. There were days where it was as much as I could do just to breathe in and out.
So you were homebound?
Yeah.
And at this point, were your wife and children aware of what was going on?
They were. The girls were still young. They were still all under the age of 10. My wife was extraordinary. I often tell people, you know, if they kind of ask for my advice, or I say, you know, whatever else you do in life, make sure you marry a no-nonsense North Yorkshire farmer's daughter. Because it turns out that that's the solution to many things that we face in life. So my wife was incredible. She, for a period of time, became effectively a single mum, raising 3 young children, working full-time in the local primary school, and worried about me. But she gave me time and space to begin to mend, and along with the support of an extraordinary group of friends, an amazing doctor, and a wonderful counsellor, I slowly began to emerge.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of Therapy Lab. If you'd like to transform your life with therapy, get 10% off your first session with any therapist on harleytherapy.com. Just use the code TherapyLab when you book your session. So you had the support of your wife first and foremost. Which professional did you turn to first, or how did you start the recovery?
Well, I guess the first step on any recovery journey is the acceptance that you're ill. I've come to understand that one of the bravest things any of us can ever do in life is to put up a hand and ask for help. So the acceptance that I was in a bad way was step one. Step two, in practical terms, was going to see my GP. And I was incredibly fortunate that he was our family doctor, and you know, he'd kind of seen our 3 girls into the world, and so he was someone we knew and trusted. So I wasn't walking in on a stranger. And it was just, funny enough, my wife had booked me in for one of those, she knew something was wrong, but she didn't fully understand what it was any more than I did. So she'd booked me in for one of those over 40s sort of MOT appointments that you get. So I was 43 when this happened to me. I'm 50 now. So she had already booked me in before I'd finally realized I was in trouble and needing help. So I had this appointment and I went in to see him, and he was wonderful. He just threw his schedule out of the window and just sat with me for as long as I needed. And he explained to me what was happening. And he explained to me what we needed to do about it. And he looked at me and he said, "And I promise you'll get better." And I didn't believe him. But there are times in your life, I guess, where you have to let other people do your believing for you. And so he told me that I was depressed, and he told me that he thought it would be a good idea if I went on to medication. And he referred me for emergency counselling. And so I started taking citalopram 7.5 years ago, and I'm still taking it now. It's the first thing I did when I woke up this morning. And you know, it's really important to say that antidepressant medication doesn't work for everybody. And it doesn't work for everybody to the same extent or to the same degree. But it does work for a lot of people, and it seems to work for me. And, you know, I may not need to take it forever, but for as long as I do need to, I will. And interestingly, over the last 7 years, I've gently scaled down the dosage to the point where at the start of this year, I was basically taking the lowest possible dosage. And then COVID came, and I've put the dose back up a little bit. Not much, but just a bit, because like so many other people, I've struggled with some of the uncertainty. So the medication's been important for me. And then Anna, my counsellor, who, you know, it was, call it potluck, call it fate.
Very lucky. So first
call it grace. So I was referred to her as an NHS referral. So I got 6 sessions on the NHS, which of course is never close to enough when you're seriously ill. But she and I found a connection, and I continued to see her for more than 5 years, and remain in touch with her now. I'd go back and see her in a heartbeat if I needed to. But she was and is amazing, and she just helped me to untangle all of my knots and just begin slowly to put myself back together again.
So that was weekly, 50-minute, the traditional format?
Yeah, so to start with, I saw her every week, probably for a couple of years. And then I started to see her fortnightly. And that was partly a financial decision, but it was also partly a reflection of the fact that I was a lot better than I had been. But it's, you know, and you know better than anyone, you know, the recovery journey is never completely linear. It's never just a steady straight line. There's always bumps, and 7.5 years on, there still are bumps. The difference is I know a little bit more about them now. They're less of a mystery. I know a little bit more about myself. And I've got some idea of what to do when they kind of jump up and bite me. You know, I did myself some fairly substantial damage, and some of it is permanent, or at least it seems to be. You know, I find it very difficult to cope with trauma now. So we're speaking only a couple of weeks after the murder of a police officer in London. I didn't know him personally, Matt Ratana, but a number of my friends did, and I can't think too much about that. It's just too painful. I have to be very careful what I watch on TV. I have to be very careful what I read. I just have to look after myself a bit. So there are some things that I can't do anymore. But in so many other ways, life is gentler and kinder and deeper and richer. And, you know, you could offer me all the wealth of all the kings who've ever lived, and I wouldn't volunteer to go back and repeat what happened 7.5 years ago. I mean, it was as bad and worse as I've described it to you. But similarly, you could offer me those same things, and I wouldn't give up the journey since. I wouldn't give up all the ways in which life has changed, all of the unexpected graces that have happened along the way. It's a part of who I am now, and it's a part of my story.
What do you think for you was the main benefits of therapy? What was it that was so helpful?
I think we could all do with a bit of therapy, probably more than a bit. I mean, it's all the things I guess you would expect. It's a safe space. It's a space where I don't have to feel guilty about taking up the time, because that's why I'm there. You know, if we're meeting socially, then there's some responsibility on me to, you know, for it to be an even-handed thing. But in a therapeutic setting, actually I've got permission just to let it all out and let it all go. So it's safe, it gives me permission. And Anna and, you know, and her colleagues, you know, you're skilled people, you know what you're doing, you know what you're talking about. And, you know, there's a lot to be said for the enthusiasm of amateurs. You know, sometimes just a chat with a mate is just the thing. But actually sometimes what you really need is professional help. And I was in a really bad way, and I needed that professional help. So for all of those reasons, it was a good thing and absolutely the right thing for me, and I'd recommend it to anyone.
And different therapists draw from different approaches.
Yeah.
Did Anna draw from anything in the CBT realm, which is thought challenging and behavior and looking at behaviors, or was it more a humanistic style and a stance where you were be able to talk about anything and she'd meet you where you were?
She was very much, and you know, stated up front, a sort of a multidisciplinarian. So the answer is all of the above, and lots more besides. Yeah. So you know, during different sessions or at different points in my journey, she would draw on different techniques that at that point in time she thought would be most helpful to me. You know, one particular session, she presented me with a tin full of old buttons, and she asked me to pick out 3 that represented who I was, who I am, and who I'd like to be. I just, you know, completely sort of from left field, but it was a beautiful thing, actually. So yeah, different times on different days, different techniques, but always, you know, with the aim of me mending.
Yeah. Did you do any other work, or did you pick up any other tools along the way? Any books that you've read, or other things like meditation or other practices?
So a combination of 2 or 3 other things. So books. I don't know whether you've come across Tim Cantifer. Dr. Tim Cantifer, he's retired now, but he's written a few books, but one of them, which I recommend to people left, right and centre, is called Depressive Illness, The Curse of the Strong. And it's a slightly dramatic title, but I always say to people, don't let that put you off. It's one of the simplest, wisest, kindest, most brilliant books I've ever read. And I read it very early on in my illness. It was about the only thing I was able to read. Yeah. But my wife read it too, and actually I think it was as helpful to her as it was to me. So yeah, a bit of recommended reading would be Tim Cantifer's book. And then I started writing myself. And initially that was very much just as well, actually, even before it became therapeutic, it was more mechanical than that. About probably 4 or 5 months into my absence from work, I was sufficiently recovered that I could envisage getting back to work one day, but knew that it wasn't yet and that I wasn't ready. And so I started sitting down at the table for initially only really 10 or 15 minutes at a time, but starting to write just to get the mechanisms of my brain working again, because my head had almost completely shut down as a consequence of the illness. And so I just started writing to try and get the cogs whirring. And of course, what I very quickly discovered, which is what so many people discover, is just how cathartic it is, how enormously cathartic it is. And having discovered the catharsis, discovered that I loved it. And I started writing stories of things that had happened to me during the course of my career and really feeling the emotion of them for the first time, which there were moments when that was pretty alarming, actually. But it was incredibly healing, because actually as an operational police officer in the thick of things, you don't have time to stop and feel, because you just need to do.
Yes.
But so often then in the aftermath, you don't give yourself permission to feel. It's just on to the next thing.
And there's no debrief sessions where you can...
Well, back in those days there weren't, or very rarely. These days things are... policing's still got a way to go, but things are way better now than they used to be. So writing's been enormously helpful to me. And then I have a personal faith. I'm not... I don't like the word religion. Religion seems to me to be the thing that starts wars, but I do have a faith. I do have I guess a spiritual life. And so for me, just quiet contemplation, prayer, that's a part of it too.
And so with the writing, what led you to write a second book? The first one was so well received, and did you have more to share and to write about?
Well, you're very kind. So the first book is a memoir. It's my story. It's the story of my policing life and all of the glorious bits of it, but it's also the story of my illness and the early years of my recovery. But having discovered that I loved writing, I wondered whether there was more to write. And particularly the second book is a much bigger story. It's about policing and the perspective that it offers on the world that we live in. So as a police officer, as I said to you right at the start, you see everything, all of life and all of death in a completely unfiltered way. It offers an absolutely unique perspective on our world. And I remember back as the borough commander of Southwark, and there was a particular day where a report came in of a particularly horrendous crime. And I just sat there and I thought, goodness me, the world out there has no idea about what's going on just next door, just down the road, in places that are enormously familiar to us and yet a million miles away. And even back then, before I was ill, before I wrote Blue, I had just had this thought in the back of my mind, do I have a responsibility, a duty even, to tell the world beyond policing about the world that policing reveals? And so I think probably the second book, which is called Crossing the Line, is the answer to that question I asked myself 7 years ago. So there are 10 principal chapters that take 10 of the biggest challenges facing us as a society, and looks at them through the lens of policing experience. So there are chapters on domestic violence and knife crime, on drugs, on alcohol. There's a whole chapter on mental health and how we deal with it as a society. And the book, I suppose, does three things. It asks what's really going on out there, what's really happening, what's going wrong in terms of society's response to those things, and then thirdly, what is it therefore that we need to do differently if we want things to change? Because fundamentally, on my Twitter profile, I describe myself as a believer in hope. Policing experience can be pretty bleak, but I absolutely flat refuse to give up on hope. I don't believe that we have to wake up the same day to the repetition of the same grim headlines.
Yeah.
I do think that it's possible to change the world.
Which is a fantastic philosophy, and even more difficult to hold because of all of the struggles that we're facing. How do you sit with regards to mental health in society on the whole? Do you think it is getting worse, and in particular with the pandemic, has it affected more people's well-being? And the other side of that is, how can we get out of it?
Gosh, there's two enormous questions. To answer the first one, yes, I think it's getting worse. And I think that was probably the case before COVID. I think COVID has merely intensified and accelerated something that was already in train. I think there are so many ways in which modern life is driving us mad. Just take, for example, the speed that we're living at. This is something I know that Matt Haig, the author of Reasons to Stay Alive, talks about a lot. And it's something I've reflected on a lot and have written about in Blue. I mean, the world is just, lockdown aside, moving at this frantic, flat-out pace, wanting and needing and demanding everything faster. We want our food faster, we want our broadband faster, we want our transport connections faster, and faster and faster and faster we go, and it's just not good for us. It's not good for any of us. So as part of the answer to your second question, what do we do about it? We need to find ways to slow the world down and to slow ourselves down. So again, when I'm talking to police officers about my experience, kind of ways to get well and stay well, yes. I talk about seeing Anna and counselling. I talk about citalopram and the importance of following doctor's orders. Yeah. But the other thing I talk about very specifically is rest. Learning how to rest in a world that is moving far too fast. And now rest, in the sense that I'm describing it, doesn't necessarily mean the absence of physical activity. You know and I know that there's acres of evidence saying that physical exercise is good for your mental health. Sometimes absolutely the thing that you need to do is to go out for a run or go to the gym, or in my case slightly more slowly walk the family dog. But fresh air and exercise are good for your mental health. But sometimes rest really does mean rest. I talk often to my colleagues about, if I'm in a room with them and I say to them, right, how many of you are in possession of a work-related electronic device? Phone, laptop, whatever. And every single hand in the room goes up. And I said, listen, you don't have to put your hands up this time. This is just a question for you to answer for yourselves. How many of you within the last week or two have found yourselves at 10:30 at night, propped up in bed, sending and receiving messages on those things? And all around the room, some people just put their hands up anyway, and lots of other people kind of looking reflective and even sheepish. And I say to them, look, stop it. Whatever else that is, it's not rest. In fact, it's just stupid. And it's making us ill. You're a parent, I'm a parent to 3 daughters. The whole social media thing, how do we strike a balance between allowing our kids, encouraging our kids to be connected to their friends, but at the same time not consumed by this sort of social media monster, which is what it is. I think we're not in great health as a society. I think we're not in great mental health. And I think the state of the world makes that worse. I think the state of politics makes that worse. Clearly, coronavirus is a huge pressure on people. But I'm still a believer in hope. Yes. And if ever a colleague contacts me, now one of the extraordinary things that happens when you tell your story is that it gives people unspoken permission to tell you theirs. And so often I'll get contacted by people either in person or in an email, and they'll just tell me a little bit of their story. Yeah. And they might ask me for my advice. And I say, look, I'm not an expert in anything. I'm just a man with some stories to tell. But I can make you 2 promises, categorically. Number 1, I promise you, you're not on your own. And mental ill health can be hugely isolating because it's all internal. Yeah. Until I started to lose an awful lot of weight and started to look a little bit more scraggly from the outside, you wouldn't have known that anything was wrong, right up until the day I ended up in A&E at hospital. There I was in my uniform with all the appearance of being competent and capable, and I was fighting it on my own. Wow. And there is this danger that you feel like you're the only person in the world experiencing this. So I say to them, I promise you that you're not on your own. There are more of this than you might realise. Oh. And then the second promise I make is the same one that my doctor made to me. I promise you will get better. And I'm able to make that promise because I know it to be true from my own experience.
John, it's such a hopeful message. You embody hope. I'm sure people listening and watching will find it of great benefit, and as well inspiration to hear your honesty, but also the journey that you've gone through to be able to look after yourself. I'm inspired. You're so articulate. I look forward to the next book. Where can people get the book? Is it just a case of good old Amazon?
It's from every good bookstore.
From every good bookstore, the official line. It's called
Crossing the Line, Lessons from a Life on Duty.
Lovely. Thank you so much for joining us, John. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Therapy Lab. Do hit subscribe to keep up to date with new episodes. To find private, affordable therapy from around the world, visit harleytherapy.com today to transform your life. We'll see you next time.